What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. Very wacky new PTR that shifts the game in an entirely new direction. So many interactions that we've become used to are getting shaken up, and I want to discuss with you guys today the observations I've made while trying to test these things on the PTR, where we've seen some pretty radical balance tweaks. I think the first nutty patch that's on everybody's mind is the McCree, or ThicCree as he's been called, where he has more health, but really the big change to me is the Peacekeeper nerf. Everyone wants to talk about how much more durable he is now, but the thing I think most players are going to notice immediately is how much harder it is to fire his Peacekeeper now that there's a huge cost to missing. McCree no longer tank busts or shield breaks nearly as well as he did on live. If there's barriers in his way or a tank diving him, it's really on Fan the Hammer to do the majority of damage, and yes, he can survive a bit longer against the tank, but I feel like it was actually the damage that was keeping characters like Winston away. But on the other hand, McCree's fire rate in squishy duels doesn't hurt him as much, I think, because as long as you learn to pace your shots, which is hard, as I said earlier, he has the durability to stand tall in a duel, basically, and just say, dance with me, and take his time and hit shots, and the burst potential is so high that the overall fire rate of having more damage over time by shooting faster isn't necessarily required. Now, there is a learning curve to this, and this is very important. Possibly the most genius part about this whole change is that I think this version of McCree is definitely harder to play, even though you might intuitively think, well, more health, that means he's more forgiving, right? Not really. I think that aim is way harder than it used to be, going back to the old recovery time. And so because of that, it'll take a masterful use of his Peacekeeper and great control to get that damage out. Kind of similar to Widowmaker, who doesn't have good shield break and doesn't have great spam cooldowns. You have small windows of time to hit your shots, and if you don't, you're not doing much, whereas old McCree could just pressure down shields and tanks and was more forgiving in that regard. Also, as well, another aspect of this, because he has a bit more HP to work with, he feels like he can play a bit more in the mix of things, and therefore this is also a buff to his stun. Yeah, it's weird to think of it like that, but because he's more durable, it means he can play in a wider set of positions, which means his stun is more applicable against dive, whereas before it was like an all or nothing glass cannon thing where either you hit it and killed the thing or you died instantly. With more health, he can withstand those things, but at the same time, he has a severe cutoff to how much damage he can do, so I'm still not sure who I think wins that matchup, and that's really important. I think at the average level of play, you're probably going to feel like McCree is just straight up nerfed, honestly, because if his aim isn't great, he feels kind of easy to exploit like he always has been. But at the highest levels of play, I'm just imagining the Carpes of the world getting something like a Brigitte pocket with extra armor, putting up his health to like 325. Like McCree becomes this mega tank, and maybe just like he physically can't die to anything and then he doesn't miss, and perhaps he's the best character in the game. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but I'll say from a design perspective, it feels fair using it and playing against it because McCree is so slow anyway and so easy to target. He's one of the easiest focus fire targets in the game. Perhaps Zenyatta is like number one, but McCree's up there in the top 5 for sure. So even when you're fighting against him, I think once you adjust, it can kind of make sense, but it's gonna take some learning because McCree with a healer attached to him means there's all sorts of things in the game that physically cannot kill McCree anymore. And that's gonna be awkward and maybe feel broken at first, but I think once we learn how to interact with those things appropriately, that might change. So for example, if McCree had a Harmony Orb on him before, as Tracer, you could one clip so well, potentially, if you dodge his stun and get headshots, that you could burst past it to kill him. Whereas now, unless your name's Kabaji or something, I don't think you're ever going to do it. But with a little bit of teamwork, does that just change, right? The health points just increases the amount of teamwork you need to focus him. He's still probably one of the better focus fire targets. It just takes a little bit more damage to get there. The durability buff does have some wacky side effects because the 250 HP mark is such a important Overwatch number because so many damage types do 120 or thereabout. For For example, Pharah rockets and Genji blade swings both do 120, meaning that Genji would need 2 swings and a dash or 3 full swings to kill him. But I think the truth is, at the modern day of Overwatch, a lot of things don't actually get used without combos. Overwatch isn't really a 1v1 game anymore, and perhaps you could say it never has been. I think it's better for us to think about the interactions of Nano Blade with a Mercy Pocket damage amp, because that's really probably the best way to use it, right? Up against McCree, does that still work? Or Pharah with a Mercy Pocket with a Hammond Pile Driver combo, does that still work? I'm like, when you start to combo against him, there's still going to be one-hit kills, but without that teamwork, McCree's gonna feel obnoxious for sure. So an interesting change, and will have vastly different effects at different levels of play, I think. Now let's move on to talk about Hanzo, who's been beaten over the head and shoulders with Jeff Kaplan's nerf stick, and over the past 2 patches now has lost so much that I struggle to see why he would be competitive over some of the other options that exist. I think we've surpassed the point now where Ashe would be better than him, perhaps not top meta. In fact, at the pro level, we're probably just going to see Widow if you want a long-range character, just because one-shot kills to the head probably are better than Ashe, even if you do put a Mercy Pocket on her. But from a ranked perspective, I think Hanzo will probably feel a bit too gimmicky, because think of it like this. He originally had Scatter Arrow way back in the day, which one-shot killed things. Then he got Storm Arrow, which was an arrow Gatling gun, which was good at all ranges and did all sorts of things. But now Storm has been nerfed to a point where the 60 damage mark really makes it feel like an afterthought. And this is probably good for design, but as far as balance is concerned, I think it probably makes it kind of useless. Because let me throw some numbers at you, right? He gets 5 Storm Arrows, they do 60 a shot. So 3 Storm Arrows do 180 damage, which means in duels, you'll have to hit 4 body shots to kill someone. Just think about going up against characters like Genji and Pharah, who are typical duels that he overshadowed and perhaps wasn't supposed to in the old versions, but back in the day, he used to straight up lose those battles, and I think he's just way more likely to do that now, where in some cases, if you pull out your Storm Arrow too early, you're basically saying, I won't have enough damage to kill you, walk towards me and kill me for free. Like against McCree, for example, who has 250 HP now, Hanzo will need to hit all 5 Storm Arrows to take him from 250 to 0. 5 Storm Arrows will do a total of 300 damage now, but the 4th one goes to 240. So it could be 4 Storm Arrows and a melee, but think how long that takes and how many opportunities his enemies have to shoot against him. And you could think of this for any character, right? Mei running on him, Reaper, whomever. Storm Arrow is of much more situational ability, and I kind of don't mind, but I also struggle to see where he'll be absolutely competitive, other than in a specialist's hands. Now, the thing I haven't mentioned is, of course, Storm Arrow can headshot, which changes this quite a bit, but I think expecting headshots with Storm Arrow isn't what made it so great before. It was that you could just spam it and dish out a lot of reliable damage quickly, and that's still the personality of it, I think. If you were going to be able to get a headshot anyway, could you have just pulled up a regular arrow and get a one-hit kill? See what I mean? I don't know if spamming the Storm Arrow necessarily worked for getting headshots a lot of times. Maybe the best Hanzo players would disagree with me on that, but overall, I think most of the time you're going to want to use his primary fire to weaken the target first, and then use Storm as a finisher, which feels good for gameplay, but also makes him a lot harder to play, which is definitely going to open the door for a lot of other characters to shine, either with the combination of his range and now his close range reliable damage both going down. So basically every other DPS that would compete for the main damage slot has an argument at the table in the new meta, I would say. Next nerf to Reaper, dropping to the original 30% lifesteal number. And the thing I want to note about this, if we just put the reaping off to the side for a second, the fact that Reaper can guarantee a flank onto you with Shadow Step because they made him invincible during it, and has one of the best escapes in the game, he already has the ability to outplay lots of stuff with just cooldowns alone. And then his shotguns aren't that hard, so he still can jump in on you, avoid your best punish ability, and burst you down. Those kills will still happen. It'll still be a key thing at the middle and lower tiers of play, and even being cheesed out at higher tiers. I mean, Spirit used to go super high in the top 500 just using Reaper flank tactics before the cooldowns were buffed. So being crafty with Reaper still gets results. They're less reliable than other things, but I think with those cooldown buffs, you realize that that's where his playstyle is, rather than the super lifesteal version that meant he could just go toe-to-toe with anything in a brawl and heal himself through it. And the reason for that, of course, this 10% reduction on lifesteal means that if we take a look at his damage per shot, it does total 140, which means 280 max, which you almost never hit the max number, but that's just where it caps out at, right? On average, you're probably maybe 2/3 of that damage value or less if you're farther away. But importantly, the range of lifesteal per shot takes a big hit, where the old version healed 56 to 112 max if you hit your shots perfectly, and maybe we can say more reliably like 30 to 70 per shot. The new old version will heal 42 to 84 max, which is just a massive drop, honestly. And based on how the range fall off works and missing some pellets and all that, you probably can expect more on the lines of 30 to 60 health per shot. And that's important because when you start to think about what a normal tank does in terms of damage, Winston does 60 damage per second, Rein does 75 per swing. So the prior version of Reaper pretty easily could surpass the max damage output of those characters, meaning you could just stand up to them, not move, and hit fairly easy broadside of a barn type shotgun shots on those tanks, and they could do nothing about it, at least in a 1v1. Now instead, he'll have to respect tanks like other characters have to, but also all in all, this makes him require that more gimmicky, crafty playstyle to get anything done, but I think that's better for the game, and if you even go back to old your Overwatch videos, I loved playing that version of Reaper. I thought it produced a fair amount of value for the difficulty required to do it, and we're just back to that again with a lot of these changes. Balance has been restored to the Force. Power creep has been taking L's all year in 2020, and by the time they're done with all these waves of balance changes, there won't actually be any power creep in the game if they keep nerfing everything like we've been asking them to do. So I'm on board. Good stuff. Now, the next two are to the double barrier tanks getting nerfed. In truth, I already felt that double barrier was pretty overrated on the live version of the game. Like, we've barely had any time to play and test this patch at all, and because of that, nobody really tests new things until they beat you hard enough that you're like, oh, maybe we should try dive on this map or whatever, right? It takes time for the player base to actually learn a patch, which is one downside to patching this quickly. Like, yes, at GM, everyone was still playing Orisa Sigma, but they also have some of the best tank players in the world. And if you weren't them, I feel just running at the enemy with Winston or Reinhardt at most levels of play is probably going to do way more for you. Like, not even close way more. So it's tricky. I can't really complain because some of these changes are top-down balanced, I feel, but I also feel like I have to speak up for the community and say that when you do top-down balancing, well, some heroes are just inaccessible to the average player. I already felt that was trending that direction, and this sort of just completes that. So with that being said, let's take a look at the changes. I think most people look to Halt as being the most significant change here, and maybe it is, but I think low-key the fusion driver nerf is the one that's going to do even more for the meta, because losing that 2 damage really adds up over time. You have to think, Orisa shooting 150 shots, spamming through a team fight, losing 2 damage on each adds up so quickly, especially when you're talking about things like shield pressure on Rein, who's running at you, or punishing tanks that often peek their heads out outside of shields, like Roadhog, Winston, and D.Va. On the live version of the game with 11 damage shots, she really could lay into them. And this was kind of a problem because at the higher tiers of play, if a tank player has basically perfect aim on these tanks, it wasn't uncommon for them to get gold damage. You kind of would feel shouldn't be a thing with Orisa, who is a tank who's like spamming endlessly and doesn't take that much aim. It's supposed to be like a supportive damage type. Well, there's some instances where when she survives forever, she just contributes to so much overall value that she punishes both the dive and rushdown playstyles. But with this number changing, both of them get better. And I think here's a good way to illustrate this, where at 11 damage per shot, her entire magazine of 150 shots would do 1,650 damage. That number should ring in your mind because how much shield health does Reinhardt have right now? 1,600. Well, now at 9 damage per bullet, it only does 1,350. And I think this key interaction is allowing for that steadfast buff on Reinhardt to really show its strength. And it's always been the case. If Rein's been able to manage his shield and get close in on you, Rein has been dominating. Rein has been low-key insane for the past couple weeks, and we haven't even had time to talk talk about it yet because there's already a new patch, but even against the old double barrier top meta, I already felt like Ryan could make serious plays at levels of play where the Orisa Sigma combo wasn't maximized. Well, now it's just by simple math. They just physically can't do the same things they used to, even when they're maximized. And this is why, if you follow Samito on Twitter, a great place to check in on his takes on the meta, wild rants in Twitter video form. But he believes that D.Va Reinhardt rushing down enemies, similar to like the stage 4 meta of last year with Lucio Moira and perhaps May Reaper. I don't know how that's going to work out, but that brawl archetype is now going to be able to run over the ranged poke archetype, which was the Sigma Orisa Baptiste ranged line of sight bunker style. Other things to consider: lower damage means her ult generation goes down quite a considerable degree, actually. And then when we take a look at the other nerfs, I'm like, the fortified nerf just feels like beating a dead horse or beating a dead Orisa at this point. And then the halt nerf, I always felt nerfing halt was tricky because at the highest levels of play, even if you only have a small window to capitalize on the snare of halt in Overwatch League, for example, they still would do that every time because their communication is good enough. But in the ranked level, where players have like a delayed reaction to your halt and it lingers in the sky for quite a while and it's a very easy setup, well, that just completely goes away. And with that, Orisa's just losing on all fronts, so much so that I don't think it's an outrageous thing to say that they've kind of killed the character, because at this point, I don't know if teamwork and maxing out the playstyle will be able to contest with simple things like mobility running at you or dodging you, building your ult slower, having less impactful damage. I think the compounding principle of all of this means that she'll either never be played or only be played in spots where you can set her up. The one saving grace to try to get diversity among the meta would be if double barrier comp still reigned supreme on long range maps. I think that probably would be a place that we could be pretty happy about, because we know what the brawl maps are. You can imagine what potential dive maps would be, but on super long range maps like Havana, which have been kind of like a double sniper playground, will you still just have enough distance on your opponent to make rush down too difficult? And dive was already like way too far of a distance for that to feel too viable, I think. So if you enjoyed the playstyle, there may still be a home for these medium range tanks, and that would be a pretty healthy spot for it to rest, I think. There's that. And then on to Sigma, who, at least in my experience, I feel like these nerfs aren't as significant as the Orisa nerfs. However, Sigma enjoyed playing in Orisa's main tank playstyle the best. I always called this kind of a double main tank situation, but it's hard for me to imagine exactly where Sigma would fit and what comps he would be good at. Like, I always thought he was pretty underrated for attacking into a defensive setup, something like Orisa Hog or maybe a Bastion setup, because he's got the movable barrier, the budget defense matrix can help him take space, and he's got range damage as well. He doesn't have to commit in to do his damage. So against those archetypes of comps, I still feel he functioned as a main tank. It just so happened that as soon as he came in, we never had to play against those style of comps anymore, unless, of course, in the mirrors where double shield got used. But you know what I mean? There was never that asymmetrical matchup for him to take advantage of. And so I'm a little bit worried for Sigma. I do think that he's pretty underrated with Reinhardt right now. You might think, well, Zarya's the best combo for Reinhardt. And yeah, she can be. But the crazy thing about Sig is that kinetic grasp can help your frontline take space, similar to how bubbles work, and powers him up. Granted, his damage doesn't go up, but his damage is so insane anyway. Just having more health allows him to play that bully style Zarya had. And the broken part about Sigma, I mean, there's lots of broken parts about Sigma, but at higher levels, the problem of his projected shield is that because you can control it so much, there was so much min-maxing you could do with it to perfectly have it wherever you need it. So once players over time really learned that, it was hard for any other tank to compete with him doing that while also being a DPS, essentially. So Samito seems to think that Rein D.Va is the go-to call, but I wonder if Sigma still can punish D.Va and maybe has a better ultimate, and I think you can easily say a higher skill threshold as well. So even after this long list of nerfs, his range goes in a bit, his combo dies where it only does 190 damage, and his ult can be interrupted. Even with all of these things, there may still be hope for Sigma just because of how high his skill cap is. I will say that going up against a character like McCree, now that he has 250 health, only being able to do 190 total with a combo feels kind of awkward. But in truth, Sigma, with his shield dancing and how much health he gets from kinetic grasp, still can hang in fights so long that he will get another volley of hyperspheres off, I feel. I don't think he was all in on that combo hitting every time, and him losing that just means he's slightly worse as an individual dueler, but his sustain abilities are so great anyway, he probably still wins a ton of 1v1s, even though the enemy might survive with 10 HP sometimes now. The range reduction makes me think that up against Pharah, it would be hard not to pick D.Va with her crazy thrusters, being able to contest her up in the sky, but against a lot of other things, I think Sigma might still have a fighting chance just based on how much you can get out of him. The ultimate change, I think, is a huge nerf, but it's something that players can play around, which is always a bit tricky to judge because it either goes one of two ways. Either it's incredibly easy to deny Sigma his ult now, or if you just play well enough, they still can't stop it anyway. So if you don't know, this is how it happens. With Gravitic Flux now, it can be canceled before targets begin falling, okay? So anytime they're still in the air from Grav Flux, if Sigma dies, gets hacked, stunned, anything that interrupts him, the ult is just lost. That's a really big deal because it used to be you could kind of int with it, set it and forget it. Even if you messed up, it would still commit the entire ultimate and the impact would go down. But he's got so many ways to keep himself alive anyway. If he just plays a little cleaner, will all of that get outplayed anyway? I'm not so sure. This does open it up to counterplay, of course, but I think that just puts it in line with most other ultimates in the game and makes it less broken, but I'm not necessarily convinced it just makes it useless either. It's still one of the highest impact ults in the game. And the last change to Baptiste, he's been reined in to be far more reasonable, but because of that, losing all of this and his lamp as he did in the last patch, it's hard to see where he'll ever be useful, honestly. Now, it's nice that the power level of healing keeps getting dropped in Overwatch. I think that's something that makes the gameplay much better because things actually happen and you can't just press a button to survive an action forever. But what a lot of the high-level players think is that this will just bring Moira back, despite her getting nerfed a while back, because she still physically puts out a ton of healing and has the best escape for any support in the game, other than Mercy who flies, but Moira's is still better. It can be used in response to things more easily. So a lot of flex supports are afraid they're going to be trapped in nail jail again, and I'm not so sure what I think. It's really going to take some time to learn this patch. It's such a radical change from what we've been playing on, and I already thought we didn't understand the current one, right? So we're at a point now where Overwatch is moving too fast, and I don't know if the community can catch up. Whereas before, it felt like Blizzard was 6 months behind. Now I feel like we're months behind because things like Reinhardt rushing down with like a revived Goats playstyle with Lucio Moira, it's something that's reportedly to be working in scrims on this patch, but I wonder if it's a style that you can learn to outplay with positioning, range damage, and more skillful play. The quickest route to success isn't always what defines the meta. They might win in the short term, but if teams get good enough at dive, will that just outplay it? I don't know. Like in theory, the rushdown playstyle can just run over Ana, for example, but if Ana positions well enough and is able to dodge that, does it just fall over, right? There's some serious rock, paper, scissors going on, I think. And with any luck, it'll be a map-dependent meta, which is what the live version of the game is, and with Double Shield likely dying, there'll probably be a combination of things tried for at least a short period of time before the easiest set of 6 get determined to apply to the most situations. So pretty interesting stuff. I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.